It's out, and it's out now in paperback, so there's absolutely no reason not to go out and buy this one. It's called Wilson, and it's written by a Pulitzer Prize winner. He wrote the book Lindbergh, which is a must-read. Scott Berg, welcome back to St. Louis, and welcome back to the Big 550 KTRS.
Thank you. Always my pleasure.
You started Wilson, 8 years ago, 9 years ago? Is that right?
13 years ago.
Why did it take so long to write the book?
Well, because I'm slow. But it took so long because, when you get into a presidential archive, there are so many, not hundreds of thousands, but millions of documents to get through to really piece together the story. Because also what I like to do is not just tell the story of Woodrow Wilson, the man who became president, but I want to tell the personal story. And at the end of the day, I found two big things. That I think Woodrow Wilson is the most influential figure of the 20th century, and I think his personal story is the most dramatic story ever to unfold in the White House.
Great reasons to spend enough time to get it right. Now, when you wrote the book Lindbergh, you were given a treasure trove of documents. The same thing also happened here with this book, right?
Well, a similar thing. In the case of Charles Lindbergh, all his papers had been locked up. And it was only because Anne Morrow Lindbergh, his widow, granted me access to everything that I was able to see everything for the first time. Nobody else had ever seen it. In the case of Wilson, he's been dead 90 years now. Most of his papers are in libraries, and they're all part of the public domain. Anybody could look at them. That being said, about 6 years ago, two major caches of Wilson's personal papers, private papers, one from his family, one from his doctor, surfaced. So tens of thousands of documents that nobody had ever seen before that really humanized Woodrow Wilson just came to light. And I think, the first and only person to see them all.
Wilson, as you say, is one of the greatest presidents and the most influential presidents. But he's almost lost to history in that you walk down the street and you say Woodrow Wilson to a lot of people, they have a blank stare on their face. There's not much remembered about him.
Well, there's truth to that. Now, a lot of that has to do with just the fact that, if it happened more than 20 years ago, we tend not to know about it.
Right.
I'm a little appalled at people today who don't know who John F. Kennedy is. And that's, 50 years ago now.
Right.
So Wilson, another 50 on top of that, well, we might as well be talking about Millard Fillmore or somebody. And that's part of the reason I wanted to write the book, because some presidents should be forgotten. This is one who definitely should not, because this is one whose legacy is with us every day.
Yeah, so let's go back to he ran on a platform not to get into World War I. Ultimately, though, we did get into World War I. What happened?
That is correct. Yeah, what happened was when he ran for re-election in 1916, he did keep us out of the war for 2 years, and for a little more after that, in fact. And this was a big change in American foreign policy and just in American identity. But Wilson believed that he had to introduce a moral component to American foreign policy. And in 1917, after the Germans had torpedoed a number of ships, hundreds of American lives had been lost, but bigger than that, Wilson believed America had a certain responsibility to do something in the world, that we couldn't just sit there and watch all the great civilizations of Europe kill each other, and that if America did get into this war with some fresh troops, we could end it rather quickly. And that proved to be the case, and he made a moral argument. As he said, the world must be made safe for democracy. And whether you like that statement or not, or whether you agree with it or not, that statement has been the basis of American foreign policy that took us to Vietnam. What do we do about Syria? What do we do about Ukraine? Anywhere in the world we go, we ask that question. You may not always like the answer. We may all disagree on the answers, But Woodrow Wilson is the first president to raise the question.
It's extraordinary. The book is Wilson. Scott Berg, Pulitzer Prize winner, not only a great writer, but a great researcher and a great storyteller. The book is Wilson.
Thank you.
So now we get into the war. He does a couple of things that's extraordinary. He puts politics aside, and the rest of the Republicans and Democrats agree with that, and they really do put politics aside, at least for a little bit?
Well, they did for a little bit because, you have to remember this was kind of the first great time that the country was entering a great war. And it was, okay, we are all Americans here for a moment. And so they did all get together. And they really turned this peacetime nation with a small army the size of the army of Portugal's, and we became this major military superpower almost overnight. We, with an army of 100,000 people, within a year, were sending 2 million soldiers overseas. I mean, just think what had to go into doing that. Just the uniforms, the guns, building the camps, the training, the whole selective service system, all that had to be done almost overnight. And that's all Woodrow Wilson, who basically, again, for good or bad, turned this peacetime country into a modern military-industrial complex.
Who is Mitchell Palmer, and why is he so important?
Well, A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General of the United States. Wilson had several of them, but he became Wilson's last Attorney General, or penultimate, almost last Attorney General. And after the war, Wilson suffered a stroke. And the reason we know Palmer's name is, while Wilson was in bed recovering from his stroke, Palmer had a kind of moment of seizing power, and he inaugurated a series of what we now call the Palmer Raids, in which he was trying to ferret out undesirables in this country with suspicious political feelings. Basically, these were socialists or communists even, and they were aliens by and large. But anyway, these Palmer raids are perhaps the blackest mark on the Wilson administration. The great irony is Wilson didn't know the raids had happened because he was upstairs in the bedroom recovering, and they kept news such as this from him.
Let's go to this stroke, because I consider myself a amateur historian, and I was floored to read that he had a stroke. Now, did he have a stroke while he was in Paris working on the peace accords?
Well, here's what happened. We can now piece it together. In retrospect, we can see Wilson was having small strokes while working on the peace accords, and there are one or two days, which I relate in the book, which just still take my breath away. There's one day where they're really carving up Europe and Asia and figuring out who owns what. And one day, Wilson, with all the leaders, says, you know what, I want to rearrange all the furniture. I don't like the purple couches next to the green chairs. And I mean, it was clearly a crazy moment, which was clearly the indication of something cerebral going on. We also now know, and this I was able to put together from going through the doctor's papers, that Wilson had been suffering small strokes most of his adult life, as far back as when he had been a college professor, which he had done for most of his life. But now, when the peace is over, and he comes back from Paris after 6 months with this treaty, with a League of Nations built in, the Senate doesn't want to buy it. Wilson goes around the country to sell the American people on a League of Nations, and he collapses in the middle of this tour. And that's when they rush him back to Washington, and a few days later he suffered a stroke, which they kept from the world. And nobody knew for a year and a half that the President of the United States had suffered a stroke.
How debilitated was he by this stroke?
He was extremely debilitated. He was paralyzed on the left side. He could still speak, and he could think. But his emotions were all over the place. His judgment was often very fuzzy, and in fact, he really wasn't physically able, certainly for the first few months after the stroke, even to get out of bed. Gradually, he could, and he could sit at a desk and he could do some work. But for the last year and a half of the Wilson administration, that is from late 1919 until March of 1921, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson became, for all intents and purposes, the first female president of the United States.
The book is called Wilson, and it is written by a fantastic storyteller and a great author. Scott Berg has wrote a number of books, including the book on Lindbergh, which won a Pulitzer Prize, which is all about, it's got St. Louis all over the place. There's another one called Kate Remembered, which was fantastic as well. His newest one, which took him years, is called Wilson. Scott Berg, our guest for a couple of more minutes. His second wife was the one who you say is the first, quote-unquote, female president. His first wife died in office. Did she not?
That is correct. And this was another real tragedy in Wilson's life. He was madly in love with his first wife. You know, they had been sort of, you know, he was a starving college professor, and, you know, she raised the three daughters with him. And there are thousands of love letters, the most passionate love letters I've ever read between these two people. And then they finally get to the White House, and she dies a year later. And the president is so bereft. He's so despondent. He can barely get out of bed. He talks about resigning. And it was only fate or fortune or providence, whatever you want to call it, but he met an attractive young widow who lived in Washington, D.C. He rather secretly courted her and was able, through, again, passionate love letters, was able to convince her to marry him, which she did in the White House.
It's almost unimaginable in 2014 to have a president suffer a stroke and no one knows. And I can only imagine, I mean, how did they keep that a secret even though it was 100 years ago?
Well, yes, and you're right. I mean, it's hard to imagine a president, say, sneezing and the whole world doesn't know.
Right.
But to suffer a stroke, it's simply, well, first of all, media was not as widespread as it is today. There was really, you know, still back in 1919, there was really virtually no national media. Everything was pretty local. So that helped. We certainly didn't have television, but even radio had not quite hooked up the entire country. And so the president was not photographed, was not reported on minute by minute the way he is today. So that's how you could get away with it. And there was also just a level of courtesy between the press and the White House, such that if the White House said, you know, nobody can see the president today, that was that. It simply wasn't questioned.
Yeah.
Now, after a few months, the country, the Congress, the press is starting to say, we have to see the president. And indeed, finally, the Republicans in Congress said, we want to send a senator or two over just to see that the president's still alive, what kind of condition he's in. And they did come over, and they staged this whole meeting where Wilson is propped up in bed. They fixed the lighting in the room, and one of his great adversaries, a Republican, came in and said, Mr. President, it's so good to see you. We've been praying for your health. And Woodrow Wilson said, which way, Senator? And in that moment, the senator realized Wilson had not only his wits, but his wit.
It's almost like an episode of Weekend at Bernie's.
Well, it virtually was that, except that he wasn't dead.
Right.
But it was the same joke. They propped him up.
Right. I mean, it's just extraordinary that this happened, and it's not a lot of Americans know that. I mean, that is an extraordinary just story about how democracy was either hijacked and or was sustained or made it through, or I mean, that's just an amazing story.
Well, and I will tell you this, the Constitution was different. The Constitution was changed after that, largely because of Woodrow Wilson, which we now have a 25th Amendment that very clearly talks about presidential disability. At what point is the president no longer able to function as president? And there's a whole line of succession about how things are dealt with. So it was a really interesting moment.
The book
but I say in the book, I think I think Mrs. Wilson and the handful of doctors keeping this a secret is, I think, the greatest conspiracy in American history.
That's a real conspiracy, and people don't talk about it, right? People make up conspiracies. Yeah. This one's a real one.
This one is real.
Yeah, the book is called Wilson. The author is Scott Berg. This is a must-read. You spent years with this man. You toiled in obscure letters and notes. If you could ask him a question or two, Scott Berg, what would you want to ask him?
Well, I think my one big question, and it's slightly antagonistic, Mr. President, but... You know, at the last minute, when the Congress wasn't going to pass the treaty, wasn't going to ratify the treaty you brought back from Paris with the League of Nations, at the last minute, the Republicans offered a compromise with some small compromises in the language, and you didn't accept it. Why not? And now, in retrospect, you know, don't you think you should have?
Right. Interesting.
Wouldn't it have been better to have most of the loaf? And maybe figure out the rest over the next few years.
Going back, I mean, he created the federal income tax. He created the Federal Reserve. Antitrust laws, child labor laws, 8-hour workdays, workers' compensation. I mean, all of those things we're still dealing with today. He invented and or implemented.
Correct. Every one that you just said.
Yeah.
It's just remarkable. When he came into office in 1913, he came in with the most progressive legislative agenda the country had ever seen, and he got most of it enacted.
Yeah, and he was a Southerner.
He was a Southerner, which most people don't realize, but he was born in Virginia, raised in the Carolinas and in Georgia, and it wasn't until he went up north to Princeton in New Jersey for college that he left the South.
Right, and very similar to Truman. In your book, he was this president of Princeton, and then he was sort of anointed governor or plucked because they thought the bosses could then control him. Very similar to Truman was sort of plucked out of obscurity because they could control him. And these two men went off to go do their own thing after being elected.
Yep. The puppets cut the strings, and the puppeteer fell, not the puppet.
The book is called Wilson. Scott Berg is our guest. I'm a big fan of yours, Scott Berg.
Thank you.
I read your books so slowly because I savor every paragraph and every sentence. It's just you're a great storyteller.
I appreciate that, McGraw.
I hate to ask you, but 9 years, please God, if I'm still doing a radio show, what will I be talking to you about in 9 years when you finish?
I don't know. It might take 10 now because I don't have an idea yet. I was hoping you might have something for me.
Well, I got plenty of ideas. When you come through St. Louis on a book signing, we'll go out and have a little coffee and a little soda, and we can talk.
Okay, and maybe it won't be coffee or soda.
You betcha. Is movie rights? Anybody think about making this a movie?
Leonardo DiCaprio's company has bought it, and we have a screenwriter at work.
Beautiful.
Yep. So that's happening, and we also have Lindbergh in the works as a television miniseries. The writers at work on that, and even my Max Perkins book starts shooting with Colin Firth in about 2 months.
How about that? You are busy on the Hollywood scene. Well, as good as those movies will be, they cannot even compare to how good that Lindbergh book was, and I'm savoring this Wilson book. Scott Berg, the best of luck to you. Be safe in your travels. You're always welcome here in St. Louis, and thank you for a well-written book, and thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
You got it. Have a good day. The book you got it. The book is called Wilson, Scott Berg, and if you've read Lindbergh is so absurdly good. It is just to sink your teeth into good. Wilson, this new one about an extraordinary president in which very few people know about, and the 100th anniversary of the starting of World War I. Good time to pick it up and enjoy it. Scott Berg, the book is Scott Berg's the author. The book is Wilson. Back in a moment.